It reminds me of this kind of sledgehammer thing, which is where you go onto your AI tool of choice, and people will often always pick the most advanced model to do their create me a meal plan for this week, whereas actually that most advanced model can actually hack government systems. That you don't need to use the sledgehammer model for that.
You don't need to drive a Formula One car to go and pick up the milk.
The Signal. You are listening to The Signal.
The Signal.
Cutting through the noise.
You are listening to The Signal.
This is The Signal, a podcast with a global perspective on journalism, media and technology. Welcome.
Hello. Nice to be here. We're back.
We're back. Tom, this week we're starting to talk about Anthropic.
Anthropic. Anthropic are one of the big AI model providers, one of the frontier labs. I don't know why I'm doing it in inverted quotes. They are one of the frontier labs.
Mm-hmm.
So Anthropic make the model Claude in the same way that OpenAI makes ChatGPT, Google makes Gemini. Anthropic are a really interesting company. They were founded by Dario Amodei and a couple of other people. He was formerly leading on security and safety at OpenAI and spun out Anthropic out of that. They are growing at an unbelievable pace, and were in the headlines recently because they have developed a model called Mythos. Mythos is a kind of a new level of performance for these models, and they initially released it to a select group of people to test it, people who work in things like cybersecurity, because they were kind of concerned about the level of capability that the model was showing. So
what does that mean?
It means that, well, I think this was documented, that the NSA spoke after testing Mythos and said that it had managed to hack most of their systems. So this is one of the great kind of risks of frontier AI is, can it create bioweapons? Can it hack systems? Does it undermine security of things like NSA systems, but also things like banking systems? You know, there are big bits of important tech infrastructure that need to be safe, and we don't know always how those systems are going to hold up under kind of new levels of risk.
It reminds me of this kind of sledgehammer thing, which is where you go onto your AI tool of choice, and people will often always pick the most advanced model to do their create me a meal plan for this week, whereas actually that most advanced model can actually hack government systems. That you don't need to use the sledgehammer model for that.
You don't need to drive a Formula One car to go and pick up the milk.
Yeah.
Not only is it going to be more expensive, but actually it's probably going to be slower and a bit more cumbersome because you're not going to be able to park. But there are various analogies that people use for things like this sledgehammer Formula One car. Anyway, Mythos, amazing model, was initially in private release with a select group of, I think there were only US organizations that were allowed to kind of test it in its earliest form.
And Anthropic is a US company.
Anthropic is a US company. This is important because we'll come back to this later. After Mythos was kind of out there, there's a lot of headlines about this. You may have seen them. We'll share some of the links. They released a public version of Mythos called Fable 5. Fable 5 was Mythos constrained. So they'd put a load of guardrails in to sort of stop it from doing things that are, dangerous or could violate security systems. Fable 5 comes out. It's amazing. I was playing around with it for some of the work that we do.
Just explain again, Mythos, Fable 5, what's...
So, I don't really know if Mythos is the model or Fable is the model. Fable is a version of Mythos that is kind of fit for public release, or was fit for public release.
Okay.
I was using it, playing around with it. It was reviewing things that I'd built, code that I'd built using other models, finding lots of gaps, like security gaps, also gaps in data, and fixing everything. It was, the most performant model by far. It was also very token hungry, so it costs a lot of money to run, which is going to be interesting kind of down the line. Anyway, after 3 days of Fable being accessible, the Trump government issued an export control notice to Anthropic saying, you can't make, Fable cannot be accessible by anybody who's not a US citizen, which is an interesting way to control AI. And we can come back to how should governments do this? Should governments do this?
But governments have regulated other things. So they regulate nuclear technology, fighter jets, missiles, advanced
Right. So
computer components.
So should governments be able to regulate frontier models? Yes. How should they do it? Maybe not like they did. Because it wasn't really clear why they'd issued this notice. Basically, just to come back to this, Anthropic pulled Fable worldwide because they felt that the conditions that the Trump White House had set wouldn't allow even Anthropic's own researchers to work on the model because they have many nationalities, many non-US citizens. They would be not allowed, and so they just pulled the model completely. There's a lot of backstory here. Basically, the understanding is that there was a vulnerability that was identified by some researchers at Amazon who flagged this to someone in the White House orbit. I think it was the Trade Secretary, maybe. Anthropic had been informed of this, didn't think it was a big deal, didn't think it was anything that other models weren't also vulnerable to. Anyway, Trump issues this export control license, and Fable is taken down. That then sparks a whole and really interesting range of responses and questions from non-US governments, from businesses based anywhere but the US, about what does it mean for a piece of technology that could potentially be a key piece of technology in a business to be able to be shut off in a non-transparent process for unclear reasons at, I think they were given 90 minutes notice.
That's not a lot. I mean, in a corporate environment, getting your IT department to do anything within 90 minutes would be difficult, let alone shutting down access to an entire model.
That 90 minutes includes all the time that Anthropic were given notice. So then it wasn't that we had 90 minutes. It was that they had 90 minutes. We realized it's gone.
Yeah.
And so actually I woke up, I think it was on a Friday morning or a Saturday morning, and Fable, this tool that I'd been using to try and do some work, and it was proving very valuable in that, was gone.
Yeah.
It's now back, but it's opened this kind of Pandora's box of questions that get at a lot of really interesting issues in AI as infrastructure. Who has access to it? How is it regulated? And can we rely on? So I mentioned at the top of the pod, ChatGPT is OpenAI. That's a US company. Claude is Anthropic. That's a US company. Gemini is Google. That's a US company. A lot of what we're doing using these models that we're kind of baking into workflows and using to design new products and getting very familiar with is basically at risk of the same thing, right? Which is at some point it could be Trump, it could be any future US president or any future government decide we're not going to let the rest of the world access this. We're going to keep it for the US.
Software has typically been exempt from these kinds of orders, but it strikes me that AI doesn't necessarily fit into the hardware box. It's also not necessarily the software box. It's something that's not been categorized necessarily before. Maybe it has been, but it's not something that can be categorized in kind of layperson's terms.
Yeah, it's it's not software. Although this same process has led businesses in France. I think France has been reevaluating whether it uses Microsoft as the default operating system for kind of civil service. So that's not an AI question, but it is a question that's raised by this.
Because if you can shut down
if you can
access
shut
to-
down a model, then you can shut down Microsoft's building models. So if AI is not a software and it's not a hardware, what is it?
Yeah,
and I think
is it a national security asset?
Is it a national? Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's also been very interesting to see. So the US model for AI has been companies building at the bleeding edge with huge infrastructure investment and a lot of questions around how the money works and can they are they going to be able to build sustainable products that can cover the costs of those infrastructure and the research that goes into it. The Chinese model has been to build almost frontier models. Estimates say that those models, so this is DeepSeek is probably the most famous, but also Qwen and Kimi and Moonshot. Those models are all open weights. Now, what that means is that instead of paying to access them per session, per usage, per token, I can download them if I have a laptop or a machine powerful enough, and I can run it locally, which is very alluring because it gives me control. Like nobody can shut that off at source, and potentially it reduces my costs. I'm not going to be forced to pay for Fable, vast sums in tokens, because once I've bought the hardware and it's running, then I just have to pay the energy cost. The rise of those models, which is potentially more accessible to more people, has sparked an interesting surge in demand for things like Mac Minis, which
So people can run things at home.
So people can run things at home, but you can't, because you can't buy a Mac Mini. I've been trying, and it's about a 12 to 16 week lead time to buy a Mac Mini now.
So what we're kind of seeing here is AI as national commercial infrastructure in a lot of cases. People are building their businesses and their business capabilities on top of technology companies' models.
Yes. And the question is, do you want to build on top of the best models, the most intelligent models, with the trade-off and risk being cost and this question of access? Yeah. Or do you want to build on slightly less intelligent, capable models, but the benefit being you have some more control over, or nobody can turn it off?
Or they're more stable. So you look at the different technology companies, some of them are a lot newer than others. Do you build on the ones that have been around a while, even if they're plodding along and getting there a bit more slowly, or do you go for the top one? I think in our experience, I don't know if this is an okay comparison, but in the world of journalism, we saw a lot of people building products on top of Twitter. And then Twitter went.
And Twitter goes, or Twitter.
And their products were gone, or like video strategies on top of Facebook's video platforming, and then Facebook changed that tool or platform or the revenue model, and stuff went overnight. So, and that's very different, I think, to building in Europe. They are building models that are going to be working across all languages across the EU, presumably kind of owned by the EU, and you can build on that. Now, whether that ends up happening and working or not is another question, but this question of do we build our infrastructure on someone else's technology that could be withdrawn or could fold as a company? Like, what's the risk there?
Yeah, and that's of course a question that newsrooms have. That's also a question that governments have, and so there's it's called model sovereignty. And so in the UK, for example, here, there is sort of like public money going into building a UK owned and operated frontier model. I think the company that's working on it is called Cosine. They've built a very good coding agent model, but they're looking to explore in France. They have Mistral, which I think the French government is also looking at sort of like public support for. There's EU initiatives to do this. I think the Swiss are also building. So each country.
You've talked about wealthy countries here.
Yes.
And that those wealthy countries can afford to do that. Where we're going to see a gap is if access to AI technology, to models is restricted globally, it means that some countries won't have access to that. And there will be other countries that do have models that they would love people to use, and people will gravitate towards those. And those models may not be as transparent. Although if you're comparing, if you've got one country withdrawing access to something incredibly powerful, what's the difference between them and another country opening up access or using or kind of dictating how it's used?
Yeah, exactly. So it is really expensive to build a model from scratch. I think
a good model.
Yeah, sure. I think that the sort of Chinese models are being used as the basis for some of these other models. And then the question is, how much can you kind of refine them and take them forward? They're very good at some things, as you flagged. Maybe they're not the most transparent. If you ask DeepSeek about Tiananmen Square, then you're not likely to get an answer that's factual. And so there is a kind of political element to the models. For things like coding, they're very good. But yeah, there's the kind of question of the technical capabilities and the money to spend in making national models if you're in the global majority. There's questions around how performant the models might be in languages. Even the Chinese models are trained on a largely English language internet. And so there's a very interesting concept of token tax, which is that models working in non-English sort of translate into English and translate back. And so the token usage is more, even if you're using it in Spanish, because there's more steps in the process. So yeah, these are all really important questions, and I think it comes back to this question of what is AI? Because I think if you ask somebody who's working at on the models in China and the general way those are being used, they would think of AI basically as electricity, as something that everyone should have access to and be able to use. And
the fuel for a lot of things that we do.
Yes.
The energy behind a lot of things.
Exactly. And that can be integrated into many different things, even if you're a small business, right? The barriers to entry for those open weights models is going to be quite low versus the very strong performing and expensive US models.
But maybe it's taking the analogy too far, but then some people are going to be operating on renewables. Some people are going to be operating on like protected nuclear. That's efficient and powerful, but not open to everyone. Some people are going to have to deal with oil and gas, and those are expensive, usually in the same countries where other things are expensive or people can't afford it. So it feels to me that kind of what you're saying is that as we transition to this new way of looking at AI, from exciting technology to the infrastructure and the energy that drives so much utility, then how is that controlled? Who should control it? Who can withdraw it? And how do you plan a business or your life around building on any one of these? I don't know, what should I build? If I'm building a business now that's heavily reliant on AI, which so many people are doing, which AI do I use? Which is the safest to use?
Great question. And I don't have an answer. There's a lot of considerations in there, right? One is companies like Anthropic and OpenAI are basically startups. They're very young companies. They've raised huge amounts of investment. They're looking to go public. It's not clear the extent to which how the market is going to receive them when they IPO. The levels of investment that they're putting into infrastructure is completely unprecedented. So you've got these sort of like young companies who've probably got the best products on the one hand. Then you've got companies like Microsoft and Google who also make amazing AI, but they have stable businesses, extremely profitable businesses. Google can afford its own infrastructure build out. Google can afford to design and manufacture its own chips. They use TPUs in their models. So they're at a huge advantage in that they don't need to raise investment and debt. That they are doing that. So there's one question around how viable are the companies. There's another question around all of these companies are in the US. At some point, is a US government going to get concerned about other countries having access to this technology and might therefore cut it, which they've kind of proved that they can. And then there's another element to this in which I think AI is a bit like electricity, which is maybe a bit more literal, which is that for all of the people building these models, they need access to a lot of energy.
Yeah.
And so to a certain extent, there's going to be there's a constraining factor around how you kind of design and architect these models. There's a constraining factor around how much data you can get. But there's a really big constraining factor around how do you get enough power, like literal energy, electricity, and water to the data centers to do
And the
both,
space for the
and
data
the space
center. Yeah.
to do the training and then run the inference, provide the service of these models, and that's not a given. So there's a big controversy recently when Anthropic signed a lease to use all of the capacity at a data center that Elon Musk had built called Colossus 1 or Colossus 2. The way that Elon Musk is powering Colossus 2 is by methane turbines, which are
Not good for the
basically
environment.
not good for the environment, illegal. He kind of like unilaterally decided this is how I'm going to do it. An environmental disaster, no local sort of like planning authority. Anthropic, which is the kind of safe and ethical AI company as their branding would have it, is using all of that. So so in some ways they are literally electricity companies.
Yeah. So the question is, these companies are, you could say, indebted or working very closely or have like constant communication with government. The founders of these companies are at the inaugurations of presidents or State of the Union. Like, what does that mean in terms of like AI sovereignty, and what does it mean in terms of an ability for a government to lean on or apply pressure to the way that models are accessed outside of those countries?
Yeah, so take a US model company that's raised a lot of debt, needs to make the money back, needs to run a sustainable business. To do that, they need access to a global market. Is the US government going to kill the company by constraining the models to the US is a really good question. I don't know. Well, I think there's one interesting point here, which is that there've been sort of talks around the models asking for public investment and maybe public ownership in them, which might actually come into the equation here. But for sure, if the models are not able to be accessed by big markets like the EU, the Gulf, Asia Pacific, then they become, I don't know, unviable, probably.
Less valuable, and they're not necessarily making money
Yeah.
yet. So
Yeah.
they do need to.
Then the follow-on risk from that is, if these companies don't make the money that they're kind of projecting, a lot of the global economy is quite reliant on them succeeding, because the valuations of the big 7 companies and chip makers and memory producers have absolutely skyrocketed over the last 2 years. And so if the question is it a bubble?
Yeah.
And I don't know if it's a bubble.
If we knew if it was a bubble, we'd be.
I hope it's not a bubble.
Making some decisions.
People talk about this with almost some relish and say,
Yeah.
I think it's a bubble and it's about to burst. And that's actually really scary, because the amount of money tied up in this bubble is potentially huge. The companies will say, and I think there's probably a lot of merit in this, that the technology is so transformative that it is going to be unimaginably profitable.
Because it's infrastructure, because it's a utility, because it's energy now.
Yeah.
If these companies were in the UK, and actually this is what we are seeing in Europe, people would right here be saying, we need to nationalize the AI models or the AI companies, which you're not going to ever get in the US.
No.
But that is kind of what Europe is saying, like, we need to nationalize AI as a utility.
Yeah, kind of.
Kind of.
And I think in the US, what's interesting is the companies, because they've got such big financial outlays, are almost asking to be part nationalized.
Yeah.
Or that's something that they've kind of hinted at. That question of, I don't know if that's, should it be nationalized in the UK? I don't know. We'll see. But what is interesting is that the UK is clearly putting public money into this. So whether that's a nationalization question, it's clearly a priority for the government. Annoyingly, DeepMind, which is basically the company that invented all of this stuff, is a Cambridge and London-based company, is a British company. And when DeepMind got acquired by Google, that's when OpenAI was started. So we have a big kind of and very talented pool of technologists here in the UK. We maybe missed an opportunity with DeepMind.
It leads to a big question, which we are not going to answer or get into today in this episode. But if we're talking about AI sovereignty, if we're talking about it being closed off in borders, what does that mean for the flow of information, for access to information, fair access? There's some kind of democracy-related issues there, like if you can't, who can access what and how, and who gets to restrict that? Is a restriction of access to AI a restriction of access to information? That is something probably that deserves a conversation of its own. But I think
I'll have to think about that. But I've not thought about it in those terms. But yeah, you're right.
It can be overwhelming. Like the knock-on effects of all of this will be felt across lots of different industries and lots of different use cases.
In the short term, the good news is Fable is back, and I'm back to token maxing. And while I'm watching the football, plugging away and making sure I hit my usage limits in any 4 hours, any given 4 hours.
Well, so on that note, thank you very much for listening to today's episode. Please follow us and like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And if you've got any comments or questions, please leave them in the comment section below. And we will try and get to questions in future episodes. Bye for now.
See you next time.